Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, we'll continue our second series, which centers around the whole-part-whole learning process that is central to MLT. Today, we'll talk about the basics of pattern instruction, what it is, why it's helpful, and how to get started. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. I hope you're well, making the best of things, and most importantly, taking care of yourself at home. Now more than ever, we need to show ourselves grace and take the pressure off ourselves to do all the things. I hope you're making time for things that bring you joy and fill you up. If you need a diversion, I hope you check out the crowdsourced lists of recorded music in various tonalities and meters that I created and shared with you in the last two episodes on tonality and meter. I've really enjoyed checking out some new music that was added by other folks, and a few have really pushed my audiation. I'll link to those again in the show notes and hope that you'll add a few as well. Before we get into today's topic, just a reminder that this podcast is sponsored by GIA Publications, publisher of many MLT-related materials, including my upcoming book, tentatively titled Weaving It All Together, A Practical Guide to Applying Gordon's Music Learning Theory in the Elementary General Music Program. Don't forget that our second giveaway from GIA is a free copy of the book, The Ways Children Learn Music by Eric Bluestein. If you're not familiar with this book, it's a great introduction to MLT and is a quick and fun read. If you already own a copy of this book, you could enter to win a copy to give to a colleague or for your music education library if you're in higher education. Or it would make a great gift for a graduating student teacher. All you need to do to enter is share this podcast on social media and add the hashtags Everyday Musicality Podcast and GIA Publications. You can do this on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Just remember to set the post privacy to public or tag Everyday Musicality Podcast on Facebook so that I'll be able to see it when I search for the hashtags. I'll be announcing the winner in the next episode, which will air on May 12th, so you have until May 5th to enter. And now, let's get into today's topic, which is part of our series looking at the whole-part-whole learning process in MLT. In episode 5, we talked about whole-part-whole learning, in which the whole refers to musical context and the part refers to musical content. In episodes 6 and 7, we talked about tonality and meter, which are the basis for tonal context and rhythm context. So, tonality and meter are the whole, which students experience through musical repertoire. To help students develop a greater understanding of the whole, in MLT, we give opportunities to focus on learning the parts of music, by which we typically mean tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. This is our musical content. Just as we develop our language fluency by building a vocabulary of familiar words that we have heard and can speak and understand, our musical fluency is developed by building a functional vocabulary of tonal patterns and rhythm patterns that we have heard and can audiate and perform. Why are tonal patterns and rhythm patterns important? In episode 3 on sequential music learning, we discussed parallels between the language learning process and the music learning process according to MLT. Another similarity between language and music learning is that both language and music involve the processing of units of meaning. Language meaning is constructed through the processing and comprehension of words. Thus, words act as a basic unit of meaning in language. Although words are made up of individual letters, we typically don't consciously focus on each letter of the words we are hearing, speaking, or reading because a letter by itself has no meaning. Similarly, individual pitches or durations by themselves have no real musical meaning. Instead, musical meaning is constructed through the audiation of tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. On page 36 of his 2012 edition of Learning Sequences in Music, Gordon explains that pitch letter names and time value names of notes are like the alphabet of music. Just like a letter doesn't have meaning in isolation, neither does an isolated pitch or isolated duration. Tonal patterns and rhythm patterns are the basic units of meaning in music. There are a number of published research studies whose findings support the value of pattern instruction in music. For example, Gritzmacher, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, conducted a study of young instrumentalists in which half of the classes experienced tonal pattern instruction and the other half didn't. And after 14 weeks, she found that the students who had experienced tonal pattern instruction were more skilled at orally identifying major and minor tonalities, and they demonstrated better melodic sight reading skills than the students who hadn't experienced tonal pattern instruction. Azera also conducted a study of young instrumentalists in which half of them received instruction that included learning tunes by ear, developing a tonal pattern and rhythm pattern vocabulary with syllables, and improvising tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. And he found that the students who had experienced pattern instruction and improvisation demonstrated a higher music achievement on their instruments, both on prepared melodies and on sight reading. I featured the latter study on my Research to Real Life blog, so I'll link to that in the show notes. In a more recent study of first and second grade students, Krista Velez, now Yadro, found that students who experienced tonal pattern instruction were better able to vocally improvise melodic endings to unfamiliar songs. So there is support for this idea that providing tonal pattern instruction and rhythm pattern instruction can help our students musically. Now, you may have noticed that I've been talking about tonal patterns and rhythm patterns separately. In MLT, we focus on the tonal and rhythmic dimensions separately in pattern instruction before combining the tonal and rhythmic dimensions later on in the form of melodic patterns. The tonal and rhythmic dimensions are initially separated in pattern instruction in MLT for several reasons. The first relates to the work of Jean Piaget, the Swiss psychologist you may remember learning about back in educational psychology class. Piaget developed a theory of cognitive development across childhood. Part of this theory is the concept of conservation, or the ability to conserve what remains the same despite other things changing. According to Piaget's theory, until children reach that conservation stage in their cognitive development, they are so focused on differences that they are unable to grasp what remains the same. The classic example of this that you may remember is the one where you would show a child a short, fat glass and a tall, skinny glass that both hold the same volume. If you were to ask that child who has not yet reached the conservation stage which glass holds more water, they will typically say that the tall, skinny glass holds more water because they will likely focus on the differences in height. Now, you could basically prove to them that the two glasses hold the same volume by filling the tall, skinny glass with water and pouring it into the short, fat glass. But a child who hasn't yet reached the conservation stage of cognitive development will still say that the tall, skinny glass holds more water. Again, this is because, until the conservation stage, children tend to be so focused on differences that they can't see what remains the same. So, for this reason, children often find it difficult to recognize that a tonal pattern remains the same when combined with different rhythm patterns, or to recognize that a rhythm pattern stays the same when combined with different tonal patterns. For example, if you were to sing bum 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 and bum ba bum, the child would likely insist that those patterns are different because they will be so focused on the varying rhythm that they are unable to grasp that the pitches stay the same. So by focusing on tonal patterns and rhythm patterns separately in pattern instruction, we allow students time to fully focus on each dimension. Another reason tonal and rhythm patterns are initially separated is that this better enables us as teachers to tailor pattern instruction to meet students' individual needs. As I discussed in episode 2 on music aptitude is multidimensional. We don't just have a single holistic music aptitude, but various levels of aptitude in each of the specific dimensions of music. And it is rare for a person to have the same level of aptitude in different dimensions. It is far more likely that a student's aptitude in the tonal dimension will differ from their aptitude in the rhythm dimension, for example. So, because students have distinct tonal and rhythm aptitudes, Quoting Gordon, each student's individual musical needs are best met when instruction matches individual levels of tonal aptitude and rhythm aptitude in conjunction with tonal pattern and rhythm pattern difficulty levels. That's from Learning Sequences in Music, page 224. So, by separating tonal pattern instruction and rhythm pattern instruction, we can help each student build skills and understanding in both dimensions to the greatest extent possible before combining them into melodic patterns. Side note, I'm planning the next series of episodes that will dig deeper into music aptitude, give an overview of available tests and why you might want to use them, and look at how we can use aptitude test results to individualize instruction for our students so that they can all be appropriately challenged and experience success. As a part of that series, our next giveaway will be one of Dr. Gordon's published music aptitude tests valued at $100. So be sure you're subscribed to this podcast so you won't miss your chance to win. Now that we've talked about the importance of separating tonal pattern instruction and rhythm pattern instruction, let's look at each of those. What do those patterns sound like, and what are some strategies for teaching them? First, let's look at tonal patterns. In MLT, a tonal pattern consists of a combination of 2, 3, or 4 pitches. That's because one pitch by itself does not imply context, and more than 4 pitches makes it difficult for us to remember the pattern. Tonal patterns are performed within a particular tonal context, typically beginning with major and minor, and initially each tonal pattern utilizes pitches from a particular harmonic function. Most often, these begin with tonic and dominant arpeggiations in major and in minor, and later other functions and tonalities can be added. First, these patterns are performed on a neutral syllable. Here are some examples of tonal patterns in major tonality. Here are some patterns. Bum bum bum. Bum 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 bum. Bum bum bum. Bum bum. Notice that before I started singing tonal patterns, I established the tonal context. That was the thing where I went Establishing context is very important. Remember, because an isolated pattern has little meaning apart from its context. As Gordon says on page 7 of his 2013 book, Quick and Easy Introductions, void of context, patterns at best are necessarily learned by rote and soon forgotten. Take language. Imagine trying to learn a new word without hearing it used in a sentence. It is by experiencing a word or a pattern within context that we are able to give it meaning, thus enhancing our understanding rather than simply memorizing. Furthermore, Gordon theorized that after we develop a sense of 2 or more tonalities, we actually audiate and perform the same pattern differently depending on the context within which we are experiencing that pattern. For example, the descending minor third pattern is experienced differently when it's acting as so, mi within the context of major tonality than when it is acting as do, la within minor tonality. So when you are teaching tonal patterns, it is important to first establish the tonal context. That could be using the sequence of tones. That's the little thing that goes ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. So it starts on the 5th scale degree and goes 5, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 7, 1. I'll do that again without the numbers. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Or if you were going to sing patterns in minor tonality, it would be ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Another way of establishing tonality could be just to go to the piano and play a simple chord progression like 1, 5, 1 in the appropriate tonality and key. So before you start teaching tonal patterns, you would establish the tonality, and then you would sing patterns of 2, 3, or 4 pitches, outlining tonic or dominant functions. When you do this, it is important to not sing the patterns in a rhythmic or metric fashion. The pitches should all be of equal length and sung without an underlying beat. So if you were to want students to echo your tonal patterns, you would sing your pattern and then briefly pause before modeling a breath with an upward gesture to indicate to students when to breathe and begin singing. It's really important to not sing tonal patterns in a metric fashion, like if I were to do this. Bum, 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 bum. If tonal patterns are sung that way, students can totally check out. They can just mindlessly imitate the patterns back to you. But by inserting that brief pause before the breath and gesture, you will be encouraging students to audiate. So here's what that might sound like. I'll sing in minor tonality this time. First, I'll establish context. Ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, bum. Bum, bum. Later on, once your students have developed a vocabulary of tonal patterns on neutral syllables, which is what we call oral learning in MLT, then you can teach the same tonal patterns on solfege, which is what we call verbal association. In verbal association pattern instruction, we can also start teaching students to recognize pattern function and categorize patterns into tonic or dominant functions using solfege. Here's what tonal pattern instruction might sound like with solfege in minor. Mi, fa, mi, re, do, ti, si, la. La, do, mi. La, do, mi. Ti, si, mi. Ti, si, mi. Mi, si. Mi, si. Do, mi, la. Do, mi, la. Since it may be difficult to picture that gesture when you cue students to sing the tonal patterns, which was what I was doing when you heard me inhale before the echo. Since it may be difficult to picture that gesture, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to a video of me teaching tonal patterns to students so that you can just get a sense of what that gesture might look like. That's not to say that how I'm doing the gesture in the video is the only way that you could do it. It's just one way, so you can see how that gesture would be coordinating with the breath and cueing students to respond. Now, before we move on to rhythm patterns, I want to mention that pattern instruction doesn't always have to be pattern echoing, nor should it be. In addition to pattern echoing, students can interact with patterns by doing things like labeling pattern function, as I mentioned earlier, or improvising patterns, or generalizing by applying syllables to new patterns, or reading or writing patterns. Students can interact with tonal patterns, or tonal content, as we also call it, using a variety of skills. Side note, in the next episode, we'll wrap up this series with an overview of something called skill learning sequence, in which we'll look at the various skills that students can develop when interacting with musical content with patterns. Now let's look at rhythm patterns. In MLT, a rhythm pattern consists of a combination of durations that are performed without pitch. These patterns can vary in length, but are typically 4 macrobeats long. Rhythm patterns are performed within a particular rhythmic context, typically beginning with duple and triple meters. First, these patterns are performed on a neutral syllable. Here are some examples in duple meter. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Notice that before I started chanting rhythm patterns, I established the metric context. When you're teaching rhythm patterns, it's important to first establish that rhythmic context. That could be using the metric sequence, that combination of microbeats and macrobeats that I did before the patterns, like this. Ba 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 ba. Or another way of establishing meter could be to perform a song or chant in that meter or tempo and then to go right into your rhythm pattern instruction. So before you start teaching rhythm patterns, you would establish meter, and then you would chant patterns that are 4 macrobeats in length. In MLT, we perform rhythm patterns void of pitch, again, so that we can focus solely on the rhythmic dimension. But you can use inflection when chanting rhythm patterns so that they sound more expressive. You wouldn't want to just chant in a monotone like ba 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 ba. That would be very boring for you and students, but you can make it musical and expressive by adding contour to your chanting, like ba 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 ba. Much more engaging that way. Now, unlike tonal patterns, When teaching rhythm patterns, you don't insert a pause before cueing students to respond, because that would break the rhythmic context. Instead, you keep the tempo and meter going and simply gesture to students on beat 4 of your pattern to indicate to them that they should take a breath when you gesture and then begin chanting. Again, if it's hard to picture what that gesture would look like and how it would coordinate with the rhythm patterns, I'll link to a video in the show notes of me teaching rhythm patterns so that you can see what that gesture might look like. Again, I'm not saying this is the only way to do rhythm pattern gestures. It's just a starting place for you to see. In the meantime, here's one more example of what that rhythm pattern instruction might sound like. I'll chant in triple meter this time. First, I'll establish context. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Later on, once your students have developed a vocabulary of rhythm patterns on neutral syllables, which is again what we call oral learning in MLT, then you can teach the same rhythm patterns with rhythm syllables, which is what we call verbal association. In verbal association pattern instruction, we can also start teaching students to recognize and name the meter based on the syllables that they're audiating, and to categorize patterns into different kinds of rhythmic functions. We'll talk in a future episode about Gordon's system of classifying rhythm pattern function. As with tonal pattern instruction, rhythm pattern instruction doesn't just have to involve echoing. It could be applying syllables to new patterns, which is what you'll see in one of the videos I linked to in the show notes. It could also involve labeling meter or pattern function, improvising patterns, reading or writing patterns, and more, which we'll talk about in the next episode. Pattern instruction can also happen in a variety of ways. Sometimes it can be very focused, as in learning sequence activities, or LSAs, which are a specific form of pattern instruction that is unique to MLT. If you look at the videos I linked to in the show notes, what you'll see are actually examples of learning sequence activities. It's a very focused form of pattern instruction that's designed to take about 5 minutes at the beginning of each class period. However, pattern instruction also can and should happen in relation to repertoire in what we refer to as classroom activities. This could involve echoing a few patterns in the context of a song or chant students are learning, or it could be recognizing where a specific tonal pattern or rhythm pattern happens in a song or chant. There are many ways we could connect patterns to the repertoire. And again, this would happen in the last whole of the whole part whole process, where students take the skills and understanding they develop through pattern instruction and apply it back to the repertoire. Finally, pattern instruction doesn't just have to be done via group response. Pattern instruction can and should involve individual response as well. By having students respond to patterns individually, we help them develop musical independence so that students can learn to really own their skills. Individual response also gives us the opportunity to assess each of our students' progress, not merely for the purposes of assigning a grade, but to get a sense of where each student is in their musical development and what they need next. Individual response also allows us to differentiate instruction. By tailoring the difficulty of the content, the specific patterns to which each student responds, we can challenge each student appropriately so that each of them can achieve. We'll talk more about individualizing instruction in the next series of episodes on music aptitude. We'll also talk in a future episode about learning sequence activities some more. If you look at the videos I linked to in the show notes, again, what you'll see are examples of learning sequence activities. So that's it for this episode on the basics of pattern instruction. To recap what we've talked about so far in this series on the whole part whole learning process in MLT. The whole refers to context, tonality, and meter, which students experience through repertoire. The part refers to content, tonal patterns, and rhythm patterns. So by interacting with patterns, students will return to the whole with greater understanding. In the next episode, I'll wrap up this series by talking about the various skills students can develop through pattern instruction, and I'll give an introduction to Gordon's skill learning sequence framework. Also, don't forget to enter to win a free copy of Eric Bluestein's book, The Ways Children Learn Music, from sponsor GIA Publications. If you already own a copy, remember you could give it to a colleague, or it would make a great gift if you have a student teacher who will be graduating. To enter, just share this podcast on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram and add the hashtags Everyday Musicality Podcast and GIA Publications. I'll be announcing the winner on May 12th, so you have until May 5th to enter. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.